Okay, so then we're gonna get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our highly curated and very exclusive reading series, Keelan in Conversation, where Keelan Hughes chats with writers from all over Ireland and the UK about their most recent works. I'm Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, run Exile and Bookville. Welcome to our new space. We just celebrated our first week here, and we could not be happier. Thanks to those of you that have come out to support Exile so far, and we look forward to meeting those of you that have not yet discovered us. Right now, I'd like to welcome Keelan Hughes, whose novel, The Wild Laughter, was one of our favorites of 2020, was long listed for the Dylan Thomas Prize, and just won the Encore Award for Outstanding Second Novel. Congratulations, Keelan. Her debut, Orchid and the Wasp, won the Collier Bristow Prize in 2019. Keelan will be in conversation with Chris Power about his debut novel, A Lonely Man, which was recently released. His story collection, Mothers, was long listed for the Rathbones Folio Prize and shortlisted for the Edge Hill Prize. I know it's about 7 o'clock or so where you're at, but thanks to the both of you for joining us this afternoon, and for everyone that's tuning in. Before we get started, I just wanted everyone to know that you can order books by both Chris and Keelan by clicking on the link in the chat, emailing us at books@exileandbookville.com, or just come see it at the store. Each book purchase comes with a signed book plate, and The Wild Laughter comes out on July 13th in paperback if you're taking pre-orders for it. We encourage all in the audience to keep your cameras on, but please stay muted until the Q&A portion of the program. You can either use the raise hand function or submit your questions or comments through the chat, and Keelan will make sure to relay them to Chris. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and enjoy the show. Take it away, Keelan.
Unmute. Thank you so much, Javier, and to Kristen as well. And thank you so much to everyone who's joining us so far. Hopefully we'll get some more people as we go along. Wonderful to be in, I think, the first week of Exile in Bookville's physicality. They're rendering, issuing forth in a very, very endearing and full of nooks and crannies space that I just got a little electronic tour of. I can't wait to go to Chicago for the first time and have somewhere to go and have someone to smile at, if not hug. I am delighted to be interviewing this evening Chris Power, who his story collection Mothers was a big hit in the UK and Ireland. I don't know if it reached readers in the US, but if it didn't, you're in for another treat after you've read A Lonely Man, which is what we're going to talk about today. It just came out with FSG in the US. And I'm just going to give a description of the plot so that I'm not going to task Chris with having to do that. And so you get a little bit of a sense of what this book is about, because A Lonely Man title might not give you a kind of a Hemingway in a bar mise en scène, and it's quite a different mise en scène this book offers. So it has a somewhat embittered British fiction writer called Robert, who is living in Berlin with his wife and children. And Robert meets a fellow writer at a book event, and they're reaching for the same book. And so that kind of gesture is the impetus for the story. This stranger is somewhat saturated, inebriated, called Patrick, although he's not Irish. Patrick has this kind of outlandish tale that Robert is very keen to hear. So he's been hired to ghostwrite the autobiography of a dissident Russian oligarch, Sergei Vanyashin. And he's been entrusted with kind of compromising information about Putin's regime. And now he's convinced, when the novel takes place, he's convinced that he's being tracked by Russian agents. There are various figures in his circle that have kind of died under suspicious circumstances. And Robert, the protagonist of the book, can't decide if this new buddy of his is lying or playing out some fantasy. But he decides to use Patrick's story without his permission as the basis for his novel. He'd been stuck trying to publish his second book. So, Chris, do you deny or accept this as the description of the book? And I might then ask you to tell us about where the spark of the story came from. Was there kind of a moment you can pinpoint as it's seeding?
I definitely accept that. That is my book. I own that. I own what you've just described. Yeah, the seed really began with the sort of the Russian side of the story. It really began, or it grew out of my sort of grim fascination with the death of Alexander Litvinenko, which occurred in London in 2006. He drank a cup of radioactive green tea. It was green tea to start with, and then it had radioactive material introduced into it. And it was a really, I mean, I'm sure lots of people can remember it. It was a very sort of, captivating case, just for the fact that this guy was taken very ill, and it took the doctors a long time to work out what was wrong with him. They tested for radiation, but they tested for gamma radiation, so nothing showed up, because polonium, which was what he was poisoned with, is alpha radiation, I think. And the odd thing was, he sort of started helping Scotland Yard detectives sort of solve his own murder while he was still alive. And he was affiliated with Boris Berezovsky, who had left Russia and fallen out with Putin after supposedly sort of being a kingmaker after Yeltsin ceded the presidency. Berezovsky spoke out against Putin. Berezovsky later died in questionable circumstances. There was a whole sort of sequence of deaths on British soil, as well as in America and elsewhere, over the subsequent years, even to the extent that when I started writing the book, the week I started writing, it was when the Skripals were poisoned, this father and daughter in Salisbury, which is a very quiet market town in the UK, and they were poisoned with this nerve agent Novichok, and the whole town was sort of shut down and quarantined and cleansed. And a few weeks later, a woman, Dawn Sturgis, died because her and her boyfriend had found in a dumpster. He was sort of dumpster diving, and he found this bottle of perfume and gave it to her as a gift, and she sprayed it. And this was what the nerve agent was in, that these agents had brought into the country. And she died shortly afterwards. So there was this, these are very sort of upsetting events, and oddly sort of public events. The sort of classic espionage tale. All these things happen sort of in a different space, or when the city's sleeping, or out in the wilds. But this was all very much woven into people's daily lives, which was brought home to me a few years after Litvinenko died. I was working in an advertising agency in central London, and I used to get sushi from this place right next to the Ritz Hotel. It wasn't a particularly classy sushi place, so I wasn't sort of flashing the cash. It just happened to be next
not
to
like
the
one Tony Soprano gets very
No, yeah, not at all. And I realized after going there habitually for a few weeks that this was the one that Litvinenko had been to, and had actually been sort of shut down for several months and decontaminated after his death, because he'd been there. Well, it had got contaminated because he'd been there a few weeks before. The same two men had tried to kill him a few weeks before, and they'd poured him a cup of tea, and he'd sat for the length of this meeting in a security company in Mayfair in their offices, and he hadn't drunk the tea. And then he went to this. There was so much radiation pouring out of this cup that everyone in that meeting room was sort of contaminated with it, albeit in a non-fatal way. But sort of where they went, they left this trail of radiation, through the center of the city. And it was just very odd sort of being in that space and feeling those two worlds sort of collapse into each other, like my sort of just mundane day to day, and this sort of this world historical kind of story, and just the idea of those sort of levels interacting, I suppose, just it planted a seed that came to fruition a few years later when I read this quite remarkable piece of investigative journalism titled "From Russia with Blood" that BuzzFeed published. It was a huge, long report that I think they worked on for at least a year, maybe two. This woman Heidi Blake led up a whole team of reporters, and that documented sort of 14 deaths of British nationals and Russian nationals on British soil that were all sort of under investigated, or verdicts of suicide seemed to be arrived at very easily when the circumstances were more sort of questionable. And reading that really sort of, I think that's when the idea moved from something, just one of those things that kind of bubbles away in the pots in your subconscious. That really brought it to the forefront of my mind, and I thought, there's something here that I can really explore, I think.
Oh wow, yeah. That sense of infiltration I can get. I was at Salisbury Festival actually, and that was the first time where I'd read that news story, but to kind of have it, the park bench pointed at, where where this took place. It does, the infiltration of this, kind of epic sort of societal manipulation and the sense of scale collapsing with the mundane. I can understand how that kind of tension maybe brought about the story. I wonder whether a writer was always the kind of the viewpoint from which the story would be told, or was the protagonist always going to be a writer, or was that kind of just your access point, so you thought that was the most honest way of giving access to that larger story?
Yeah, it wasn't always going to be the way in, but I was thinking of, I was reading about these people, particularly these British citizens who had got mixed up in this, and they were all like, or at least the way they were presented in the reporting that I've seen, both that BuzzFeed report and other stuff I've sort of read around the subject, they were all presented as kind of quite mercenary, quite sort of wheeling dealing kind of guys. They were like sort of like money makers, sort of entrepreneurs who would bend the rules or outright break them, or lawyers who were very good at sort of constructing networks of offshore accounts for high net worth individuals. So they were all sort of, they knew the world that they were in, albeit maybe they didn't sort of know that the sort of level of danger they were in, but they had that knowledge. And I didn't really, that wasn't the kind of character I wanted to have at the center of this. And the idea of a ghostwriter occurred really as someone who, can be of that world without being necessarily compromised by it, or not from the off anyway. They can enter that world as an innocent, but legitimately sort of be at the heart of it. Because Van Yashin wants Patrick to write this book, so he wants to give him information, albeit he's slightly mysterious, and the information he gives him seems to, Patrick never quite works out where the truth lies in what Van Yashin tells him. But then having introduced one writer, I quickly introduced another, because, why not? If people are complaining about, all these books that have writers as the main characters, I'm like, okay, well, I better have two, just to get rid of that criticism.
A ghost writing.
A ghost writing, yeah. It didn't feel so meta or clever at the time. It was just, it was an organic thing. But it was interesting because that sort of shifted the focus, and then the Russian story was no longer at the very heart of it. The heart of it really became this relationship between Robert and Patrick, and that sort of the nature of their relationship, which is a sort of a predatory one, really, in the way that Robert wants to get at the story Patrick has. You know, he doesn't know if he doesn't really believe everything that Patrick's telling him. He certainly doesn't think Patrick's being sort of pursued by the FSB or the SVR or whichever agency it might be. But he really wants that story. So he sort of presents himself as a false friend, because Patrick doesn't really know anyone else in Berlin. So and then that really became, well, it was a boon, because then I was really interested in two distinct sort of narrative centers, if you like. So I could sort of work on each of them and see how they would sort of intertwine, which was the most sort of fun and often maddening aspect of it, sort of trying to get that balance right.
Yeah. And I mean, if Robert Prow and there's the Power Prow up there was to write this book, I think it wouldn't be written. So it's fair to say that you're a better writer than either of the writers that you that you've delivered. But it might be a nice point just to have a little reading, if you would oblige us, Chris. And then
sure.
We'll get a sense of what this voice is like that's telling the story.
I'm just going to read a little bit after. This is when Robert has had a meal with Patrick and heard a little bit more about his involvement with this oligarch, and it sort of spurs him to do a little research of his own about that world. Back at the apartment, he spent most of the day online, searching news stories and articles. Reading about the death of Sergei Vanyashin, a few details of the incident came back to him. As Patrick said, Vanyashin had been found hanging from an oak in the woods outside his Buckinghamshire estate nearly a year ago. Robert saw a photograph, a bare tree with a carpet of dark, dead leaves around it. There was a ribbon of red and white police tape running across the picture, twisting so the repeating words, "police in a cordon," were upside down. Beyond the tape, a white canvas tent was pitched at one side of the tree. Vanyashin's body had been removed, but Robert assumed the branch he used was the lowest one, long and thick and maybe 3 meters above the ground. He used a belt, the news report said. Robert couldn't work out the logistics of it, especially given the shape Vanyashin was in around the time of his death, but perhaps he was more athletic than the short, stocky man in the newspaper pictures appeared to be. The obituaries described him as someone who came from nothing, a failed theatre director who discovered a talent for making deals in the chaotic period when 70 years of communism were swapped for instant free market capitalism. In 1987, he was driving a cab in Moscow. 10 years later, he had a property empire, one of Russia's biggest independent radio stations, and a small but apparently well-respected newspaper. Following link after link, the tabs on his browser growing thinner with each click, Robert toured the disordered and bloody landscape of Yeltsin and Putin's Russia. He read about how the oligarchs had written their own rules during Yeltsin's presidency, and how, when Putin came to power and demanded their loyalty, most gave it to him. Those who didn't were either imprisoned or exiled. Some were dead now, including Vanyashin. A few months before him, Boris Berezovsky was found, also hanged, in the bathroom of an Ascot mansion. A year earlier, another Russian, Alexander Perepolichny, Robert remembered Patrick mentioning the name, had collapsed while jogging, and there were numerous other whistleblowers and critics who seemed to have been made to pay for their actions. Alexander Litvinenko, poisoned with radioactive tea while his alleged murderer was given immunity to prosecution by being made a member of parliament. Several journalists, including Anna Politkovskaya, who was shot dead outside her apartment. The opposition leader Alexei Navalny, threatened and repeatedly arrested. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was the richest man in Russia when he was thrown in prison a decade before. Looking at these half-familiar events in sequence, a connected narrative running from the end of the Soviet system to now, the wars in Chechnya, Putin's rise, the apartment block bombings, the sieges at the Moscow Theatre and in Beslan, the dismantling of Yukos, Litvinenko's killing, the invasion of Georgia and the current conflict in Ukraine. Robert saw modern Russia as an extreme case of state masterminded corruption and violence. If Patrick's story about being on the run was a fantasy, he had chosen a credible enough villain.
Thank you very much. It's very gripping. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit in a while about genre stuff, but lest I get too meta too quickly or too high level too quickly, kind of thematically, the story interrogates ownership, literary ownership as well. Whose story is whose, what we really know, and therefore what we're entitled to tell. And I wonder, were those questions thought experiments for you, or was there something, was there quite a lot at stake in your kind of troubling those waters?
I think, I think a bit of both. I think I've never sort of consciously performed a thought experiment in my life, but writing I think writing does make a journey from, or performs a movement from an emotional space to a more intellectual or technical space along the way. Like, I think there's a lot of material in this book that began in an emotional sense, in that some stuff is drawn from my own life, whether that's the relationship between Robert and his wife, which isn't the relationship between me and my wife, but there are lots of elements of it that are sort of magpie-like, kind of, I'll take that and I'll take this and I'll combine it all. Personal stuff around the death of a friend, but along the way, as you work on this material and go over it again and again and again, it becomes I think it has to become at some point sort of detached from that original emotional space that it came out of, because now it's a piece of writing and you're trying to make it the best piece of writing you can, and you're also trying to make it fit in with all the other moving parts of the novel. So you start viewing it in quite a dispassionate way, I think. I mean, you can love it, like hopefully you love your own writing, because you should probably be your own biggest fan and your own, it's like, staunchest critic, I suppose, ideally.
After your mother, if you have one.
Yeah, I think I like it more than my mum does. I think because you're viewing it that way, that in itself sort of fed into how I wrote about Robert, because Robert is someone who seeks to justify at numerous points what he's doing. Like, he knows that what he's doing is unethical, to say the least. I mean, possibly even certainly deceitful and cruel, to use this person in the way he's doing so. But he does it in such a way that I don't think it's not immediately so, or it's sort of incremental, and he kind of almost hides from himself what he's doing. He just wants to extract that story. And I think, writers are sometimes quite mercenary in the way they extract stories, and then perhaps they justify it to themselves afterwards.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of in terms of what's at stake, like, that's a big question to be asking yourself as a writer, because whatever way you come out of that, you fear straight away that actually you cannot be honest with yourself about that. You have no choice in the matter, because it's like addiction. It has its own brain. Like, addiction has its own brain in a person's body, and it moves their life about to facilitate it. Writing, I think, well, at least for me, I feel like that's how it operates. And so I don't know that I would ever be able to not manipulate my own philosophy in order to facilitate that end goal of maintaining the writing and facilitating the writing. So it, you know, I find that really interesting, and quite unlike I wanted to sit in that space with the book, but I was kind of terrified at where you might come out. And you know, and I like there does seem to be some kind of warning about the dearth of compassion somehow in the book. I wonder when you thought, or did you think that that was something that warning might be lingering?
I don't know. That's really interesting way of putting it. I think, yeah, I guess, I mean, it is sort of pessimistic in that regard. Certainly in that relationship, you know, when it comes to a sort of stark decision about who you look after when you're forced to make a decision, when you're pushed into a corner like that. Obviously, talking around the sort of specifics to not give too much away, but at the same time, I think, you know, as a writer, you don't have to be as Robert is. You can, you know, he's in a sort of, he's an extreme case, if you like, and I think you can do the right thing. You can, you know, if you're sort of taking someone's story, you probably know inside yourself whether it's the sort of thing that doesn't really matter, it's just one of those things, or it was an anecdote or whatever, or if you should actually contact them and say, you know, look, I'm writing this thing. Then it's another level about whether you sort of ask their permission, or if you're just informing them, or and that's a sort of individual choice as well, I think. So I think there are, while in this instance, yeah, there is a sort of warning to do with compassion. I would hate to think that was I wouldn't want to like universalize from this case.
Sure, yeah, and it can be maybe a slightly tamer and more kind of easier to swallow warning, if there is one, about prizing fiction over life itself, because you know, I do, yeah, well, I also don't want to spoil anything about the book, but there's a journey, a back and forth, and a movement around that, with the protagonist, that I find really interesting. And as a reader, I was waiting for those moments, those interactions with his family, you know, to see what kind of blind spots they had, you know, his children had and his wife had, if any, or what their kind of philosophies were and how they differed to Robert's. But you know, like when you have more than one book, your own preoccupations, your kind of cold sores come out on the page, and you know, horrifyingly. I've discovered, and I wonder what for you has kind of was the thing that recurred maybe in a surprising way to you in this book. Like you know, there's greed and despair, murder, betrayal, the fear about a lack of original ideas. Were those were any of those hang-ups, like, or do they feel like mega themes to you, or thankfully are they just in this book?
Yeah, that's, I don't know. I think the idea thing, I think, was always I did used to think, oh, I don't have, you know, any ideas. Where am I going to get ideas from? And just, this was when I was younger and I was writing very fitfully and not very successfully. And I think I was not, I just didn't have the confidence to sort of, to find stories in my own experience. I was always looking outside my own experience. Ironic that I'm bringing this up when I've written something that's that's quite far outside my own experience. But when I started writing stuff that to me was sort of something like the sort of platonic ideal of my writing that existed in my head, but that never existed on the page prior to that. It was partly because I think I'd sort of I'd lived more and I'd experienced more, and I wasn't trying to, you know, fake emotion. And I found that once you can sort of, I think, write with a sort of emotional honesty and exposure, I suppose, then you find that you can start imagining your way into situations that aren't necessarily, you know, your own or exactly your own. And that's how you can start sort of creating, I think. And before, I was just starting sort of trying to jump to that like creation bit. I mean, I spent a long time in my early 20s just trying to write stuff set in like Iowan cornfields, because I'd read Dennis Johnson when I was like 18, and it completely rewired my brain. But then I was like, oh yeah, I want to write like that. But then back then I thought writing like that meant sort of writing stuff that was very similar to that, which of course, you know, is ridiculous. A, you don't try and write like Dennis Johnson because he's a genius, and B, you know, I hadn't yet been to an Iowa cornfield. That came later, but yeah, I think the sort of recurring themes. I'm really interested in the way. I mean, those are sort of normally things that are made apparent to you by other readers. I find, I don't know what it's like for you, but I'm always sort of a bit naive about the content of my own stuff, I suppose, or forgetful about it. I don't know what it is, but some, you know, other people will sort of remark on similarities, say between stuff that's in the stories in my first book, Mothers, and stuff that in A Lonely Man that made them think of that, you know. In fact, I can hold on, I should have I've got the US edition here.
Yeah, very nice. It's lovely. Both of the covers are lovely.
They are.
And so your first collection, your first book was a collection of stories, and you also wrote a column for The Guardian from 2007 to 2020. That is some good longevity for any kind of a writing project. And it was called A Brief Survey of the Short Story. It, you know, it spanned everyone from H.P. Lovecraft to Lucia Berlin and beyond. I wonder, did you decide that you'd attempt to write a novel, or was it a kind of a short story that grew legs? And can you talk a little bit about that, about, you know, the experience of writing it, if you did kind of sit down to try and write a novel, to see whether you could, you know, how it differed to the experience of writing up to then for you?
Yeah, no, it was definitely the idea when it arrived, or when it really started to develop, definitely felt like a novel. And it's partly, yeah, it's a bit chicken and egg, but it's when Faber, my UK publisher, bought Mothers, they bought a novel as well. Like, it was just you know, it was decreed that my next book shall be a novel. And it was a sort of happy accident that this idea I had sort of arrived and presented itself as a novel. And I knew it was immediately, because I had, a few years before that, I'd tried to write a novel for the sake of writing a novel, and it had been a disastrous experience, because I was just trying to force something that wasn't, you know, that wasn't there. And in terms of the difference, I mean, I found it, you know, on the day-to-day sense, that it was no different at all. It was you know, quite difficult all the time, just the same way that writing a short story is just getting a sentence to sort of function. I tend to redraft a lot, so I'll go through a lot of you know, crap stages with something where I think, oh, this is okay, and then I put it away for a few weeks and I look at it and go, oh no, it's awful, and now I need to rewrite it, and that repeats itself, you know, over a number of months or years. But in terms of, yeah, just in terms of the length of the project, I mean, you know, I struggle to think of, I'm trying to think of other jobs where you go so long with something without getting any feedback on it. And in fact, you can't, it would be bad to get feedback on it, you know, because it's too soon.
Yeah.
So you kind of hide away and Can you think of one? Can you
Well,
think
I
of
can just
something
think of like I live with a scientist, and in good science, that's what happens. Like
right?
you
Yeah.
don't
Okay.
know where the data is going to, what whether there's going to be any statistically significant data. The collection period can go on and on. The analysis
Yeah.
period
Good
can go on
point.
and on. Like if the corporatization of universities is stopping all of that. But in theory, and at least in good practice, it should take a long time going into an unknown, and which is actually weirdly like novel writing, not being sure whether or not the investment of time is going to pay off, and that's excruciating. And I think that's what gives that discipline a lot of its integrity.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the difference between novels and short story. Yeah, you can tell if a short story is worth pursuing within a 2 or 3 weeks, probably, if you're working on it consistently and you get a draft done. If it's fundamentally sound, it might still take you years to get it right or to complete it to your satisfaction, but you can kind of tell if it's going to work. But with this, for 8 months or maybe even a year, I was just I excuse the profanity, but I remember just getting dressed one day and I was like, what if it's shit? Like, what if it might just be terrible? And I've put all this time into it, and I have to put yet more time into it to work out if it's if that's indeed the case. And so that's the sort of maddening aspects of it. But yeah, you're right, science. I guess building the Large Hadron Super Collider in CERN was a little more time investment than me writing my novel. That's true.
Just your very mild profanity there has me feeling the need to really up the ante on the profanity. I remember the line in the book about Nigel Farage is a cunt. Is that a line in your novel?
Yeah.
It was so gratifying as a reader, you're definitely preaching to the converted
Right. I know exactly.
But still gratifying. And I wonder, I know that a lot of the reviews have talked about the genres. They've kind of thrown up everything from literary thriller, American noir, British spy thriller, Nordic crime, whatever. There's been all of this in autofiction and as another genre, and I never read it as autofiction in that kind of tradition that is developing. But I wonder, did you battle against those genre affiliations? Did you feel that this is going to have a thriller-esque plot description on the back, and did you worry that it wouldn't be thrillerish enough for the thriller fans, or did you kind of want to lure the thriller fans to pick up your very literary book that was not going to gratify them, or that maybe you hoped that it did? And did you stalk the internet to find out, were they thrilled?
Wow. Yeah, I'm sure all those things ran through my head. All of them and nothing. I kind of no, I mean, I wanted it to, I knew obviously, yes, it involves potential political assassination, supposed political assassination, and some real life events and things that would fit into a spy novel, but also things that didn't. A lot of stuff about Robert and his kids and his family and that sort of domesticity, which in a thriller would be could exist at the start in a sort of scene setting way, but then tends to get removed from the equation for whatever reason. The hero, he or she goes to another location, or real life sort of gets cleared up so that the thriller can proceed. Whereas I always wanted this to be something where those two worlds existed in parallel for the majority of the book, if not all the book, partly because of that original spur, I think, when it was those sort of two worlds intermingling, and partly because if this sort of thing happened to you when it's sort of like corner of the eye stuff, when it's like a window that's open that's not usually open, or whether it's someone who you think might be sort of staring at you on a tram and you don't know if they are or not. They're things that you can sort of write off as just one of those things, just something strange, but you don't immediately leap to, oh God, I'm being tailed by, state security services. So I was interested in those things coexisting, as they kind of did in the lives of people like Alexander Litvinenko. He had a wife and child, and they were, integrating in English society, and he had this sort of, normal life going on alongside his sort of day job, gathering security secrets that sort of put him in jeopardy. But as I was writing it, I wasn't trying to conform to or flee any sort of genre, really. I was just trying to stay focused on the story I was trying to tell, albeit I must admit I did the first ending I wrote, which was scrapped and completely rewritten, was a sort of, it was me, I think, falling into a sort of well, what would happen in a thriller? Like, this would be the kind of ending. It was a bit, and as a result, it didn't really fit, because I think, while I was very interested in making the narrative sort of lean and as compelling as possible, I mean, I kind of want to do that in all my writing. Like, I'm interested in creating writing that has a certain sort of intensity and compulsion to it, whether it's sort of the subjects that I write about in Mothers, whether it's a sort of, debauched wedding or a walking holiday gone wrong, or whether it's this stuff that's more sort of explicitly in that realm. I'm interested in writing that has some sort of distinct current running through it at all times. But then I started to find that I wanted that to be in the domestic scenes, as well as the sort of more traditionally sort of Le Carré-esque sort of material, So I think a friend who read an early draft said, oh, you've written a thriller about someone who's too busy to be in a thriller, because of all this like family stuff, which I really liked, and which I kind of kept thinking back to as I wrote on.
Yeah, very good. You mentioned Le Carré there, and I mean, if I were to collate all of the influences or homages to, or touchstones, or that were mentioned in your reviews, they'd fill a sizable index. And I wonder from everyone from Highsmith to Le Carré, as you mentioned, to Kuske. Is there anyone, for a bit of controversy, that you kind of didn't really want to be evoked by your novel? I'm sorry for asking it.
No, well, no one that I can think of. I mean, maybe lots of like sort of random names that wouldn't have been thrown at me anyway. But there was some, like Eric Ambler kept getting mentioned, and I'm like, well, that's cool. But I know a little bit about Eric Ambler, but I've never read any Eric Ambler. But I will, it's given me a bit of a reading guide, some of those comparisons, which is fun, which I enjoy. But I guess it's
none that make you cringe.
Nothing that makes me cringe. And some of them, I mean, obviously people mentioned Bolaño because he's quite explicitly mentioned in the text. And I guess he is, when I first wrote down I wrote down like 120 word sort of description of the book, kind of like jacket copy you'd read, like two men meet in a bookshop in Berlin and blah, 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 blah. Which I dug out not long ago. Actually, I'd sort of forgotten what I had on that sheet. And it was pretty much, it was largely faithful to what I'd written, albeit, because you're used to sort of things change along the way, but that original ground plan was sort of true. But I had written on that I'd written the names Roberto Bolaño and Patrick Modiano as sort of touchstones or sort of tutelary spirits, because I find, their work, Modiano sort of consistently with the sort of detective genre, and Bolaño more sort of eclectically, I suppose, but he draws in elements of genre and picks them up and uses them and then puts them down, but he's just doing his own thing, but he's well versed enough in those areas that he can sort of use them, and not in like a knowing way. He's like sort of passionate about them as well, but he I like that aspect of sort of, sometimes you get people sort of like renouncing genre or thinking they're above it or whatever, but I think all genres contain some really amazing writing if you just sort of know where to look, or you find the stuff that chimes with you. So although I haven't read a lot of the people I've been compared to, I'm looking forward to diving in, because it sounds like I might like them if they like my stuff.
One other thing I want to ask you about, and if anyone in the audience has a question, I'll have a look at the chat to see if any pop up. But I wanted to say to ask you about the setting. So it's set in Berlin, where neither of the central characters are from, and I wonder about the novel's relationship to cities. Has that got to do with encounter? And is encounter one of the real pursuits and romances of the novel? I
think, I mean, I live in a city. I live in London. I grew up just outside London, and I've always loved it. There's lots of problems with it, as there are in any big city. Any large gathering of humans has numerous problems, but it has a lot of wonderful aspects as well, and yeah, chance encounter is obviously one of them, whether that's actually meeting a person, as Robert does, and a relationship growing out of that, whether it's just the sort of stream of inputs you kind of receive every day just through walking down a busy street, and I think, yeah, there is that level of never knowing what's around the next corner. That is one of the charms and the dangers and the romantic aspects of dwelling in the city. And I think, in Berlin's a city I really love and have been to a lot. I've never lived there. My wife and I were seriously considering it a few years ago, but then we sort of dragged our heels, and then our oldest daughter started going to school, and then suddenly you're in a sort of, everything sort of changes a little bit, or it becomes more of a procedure to do it. But since sort of 2001, I've been going there regularly. I've got good friends there, and I mean, it's a wonderful city, and it really is a city of random encounters and chance events. It's kind of that to the nth degree.
With what the last year has been like, that those priorities are coming to the fore in a way that people might not have negotiated them before, or really been wanting or interested in pinning down exactly what it is that they, what is they're willing to take, whatever the costs of living in a city, why are they willing to take those costs? And I think encounter is definitely one of the aspects that this novel kind of shows up. And I was also wondering if you were thinking about kind of solitude and community. This is kind of pandemic inspired in questions, because as you're, I wonder if you think it reads differently now. Does it read differently now to when you wrote it? It's guarded relationships. The relationship, the difference of those moments in the novel that are in these remote protected, kind of Swedish hillside places, and then the more urban cafe environments. And because the title is maybe a red herring then.
Well, I think it's more sort of like, it has sort of valency, and I think it sort of points in several directions. And I think, Robert is sort of, he has this sort of, Patrick's a ghostwriter. Robert has this sort of sensation of ghosting through aspects of his life. Like when he's away from his family, he's either, well, he's playing this very different role with Patrick, or often he's sort of alone and sometimes almost like uncorporeal, or he has this feeling of uncorporeality sometimes, as if he needs sort of something around him to sort of snap him into focus, whether that's his family or whether that's this project of the book. And I think cities do sort of facilitate that in a way that you can be alone in the midst of people. And I think that's probably easier to deal with, although I guess it has a tantalizing aspect as well, because you sort of see this other life that's almost behind glass to you. But when you're alone in a cabin beside a lake in Sweden, as he is at one point, I don't know, I think you trammel between sort of, or shuttle rather, between enjoying that sort of solitude and also being threatened by it, or it can become oppressive in a way that I guess doesn't have as easy an escape from as a city, where you can sort of, if you're capable of doing it, you can insert yourself into a social situation, but you can't really do that in a lakeside retreat in Sweden.
Yeah, the city facilitates a kind of moral ambiguity, which is key to this novel coming off, and the kind of evasive quality as well. I was going to ask you if you had made craft choices to achieve the evasive quality. Even there were moments the first time I read it where I kind of lost track of when we were in the novel in progress that he's writing and when we were in the story being related to him, I don't know that you'll kind of have a response to that, but I was I had been wondering how you kind of achieved that quality when I was rereading it, but now I can see that certainly the use of the setting is part of that. You feel he's more exposed when he's in Sweden. There's almost nothing to hide behind. He has to decide, is he willing to pay a fair price for whatever the construction work is being done, or the repair work. I can't remember what it is exactly. I just remember, he seems so kind
their plumbing broke.
And he seems so limp in that moment, in a way that he might have had some kind of more, protection and kind of armor around him in a city environment. Maybe we've got time for one more question, and I don't see any in the chat, so I'm going to fire ahead with my own selfishly. Do you think about this as being a European novel over and above an English one? Because the characters are, the central characters are, it's a British family, and does the novel have a relationship with England?
I think at sort of 10 years so. I mean, Roberts grew up in England, but his wife's Swedish, and so his kids are, half and half. I think it's, I would think of it as a European novel, but that doesn't necessarily I've thought of myself as a European for, all my life, until my government told me that I apparently wasn't one, or until 38% of our population decide we weren't one. But let's not get into referendum politics. But yeah, I think now more than ever, I'd like to be a European writer rather than a a British one or one from the British Isles or the UK or whatever. But I think, you know, those sort of boundaries, I mean, I suppose because my touch points are, you know, someone the other day said, oh, it made them think of Javier Marias, which is like just incredible, you know, praise and not worthiness responses from me. But that's, you know, a lot of the names, like you mentioned, that have been sort of thrown about in reviews are, if not European writers, then sort of cosmopolitan ones, or writers who were interested in looking both within their own borders and beyond. Someone like Graham Greene, who you know, wrote stories set all around the world, and I think sort of, albeit it was writing in a more colonial era, I think sort of, you know, looked or tried to look into the heart of those countries that he was, you know, he wasn't just setting stuff in places just for sort of local color. There were aspects of the book that sort of went deeper than that. And I think in my writing, like I've actually just started writing another book which is set in England, which is the first sort of thing I've done. I mean, a couple of the stories in Mothers take place in the UK, but most of them are all over the world. And I don't know why, you know, it wasn't a conscious decision, but those are naturally the stories I've sort of gravitated towards telling for whatever reason.
Oh wow! And is it enlivening, the fact that you're writing a whole book? Is it a novel set in England, or is it kind of do you feel that, you know, the impulse to do this is maybe going to bring out some questions that you haven't been asking in books before, because you haven't spent so long in that environment on the page?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I would hope it will involve different questions to the ones I've sort of asked myself. But then I sort of, you know, at this stage, or in the early drafts stage, I don't really consciously ask myself any questions. I just have the sort of story and the characters, and I sort of, you know, that sort of get into a muddle with all of that and try and get that mess down on the page, and then I guess the questions arise and keep arising, because I'll be asked stuff about A Lonely Man that sort of hadn't necessarily occurred to me, or I hadn't sort of framed it that way, but I can see that it's in the material, which is always why it's nice being asked, you know, good questions about it, because it sort of it regenerates that meaning that's within the book. Yeah, thanks. I had that moment recently in an Italian interview where, like, a really, really large aspect of the Wild Laughter, just of a craft choice I made, you know, subconsciously, became kind of so centrally important, you know, to the main kind of the main story, and I hadn't seen it before, and like I had talked about it for a year. So yeah, it's weird how that can happen. But we better let these folks get back to their work day. I think some people are coming in their break in the US, and if I think Javier will have some housekeeping. But thank you so much, Chris. That was really fascinating, and I hope that everybody is Thank you, Keelan.
Inspired to pick up a copy of A Lonely Man. And I also really recommend the collection Mothers as well. It's a fabulous collection of stories, and it's, you know, you can definitely see the same voice through it, but they're very different. They're very different books with a very different kind of aesthetic and sensibility, and that's I always enjoy that when a writer's able to have very distinctive books.
Thank you, Keelan.
Once again, as always, Keelan, you always come prepared and ask some of the best questions, and this was no different. Thank you so much, Chris and Keelan, for joining us today, and thanks everyone for showing up on your lunch breaks. And you can watch this over and over again and catch all the nuances of the conversation. Thank you, Lauren, for showing up. Quick note, Chris, if you were, I read a lot of like World War I, World War II spy fiction. And if there, Eric Ambler is by far, I mean, he's considered the godfather of the spy novel. And
Yeah,
he was sort of
absolutely.
writing things as they were happening. And he writes these really short, non-series, incredible novels that speak to the time. And Coffin for Demetrios is one of my favorites, my favorite of that. I mean, just in general, just one of my favorite books of all time. So
Okay, I'm going
I
to
would
get hold
highly
of that
suggest
for
that Eric
sure.
Ambler. But once again, thanks. You can purchase books through the link, but also you can go to books at exileandbookville.com or just come see us at the store. We'll be happy to sell you a book here now. Thanks, Keelan, again. I mean, we'll see you in a couple of months and hopefully maybe later in the year in Chicago. And Chris, good luck. And we hope to see you again soon. If there's anything we can do for you, please let us know. And if you're ever in Chicago, please stop in and say hi.
I will, for sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
right.
Evie. Thanks,
All right.
Kristen.
Thanks everyone for showing up. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.